So hello, everyone. Welcome to our dialogue with the author today. My name is Dawn Dole, and I'm the Executive Director for the Taos Institute. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit educational organization, and we offer many different ways to explore and work with social construction and relational practice and theory as it applies to many, many different disciplines and aspects of our life. So we offer these dialogue with the author series. It's about once a month, and we try to feature books either that are new or maybe have been around a while but just need some special attention, that look at whatever it is their topic is from a constructionist perspective. And we really want to highlight that and the relational and the collaborative and the dialogic processes that people use in their work. And so these books feature some of those opportunities to learn and grow and be in dialogue with the author. So today I'd like to welcome Bill Blaine-Wallace, who is the author of this book. And Bill is an Episcopal priest. He's been a parish minister and a college chaplain. He's been a pastoral counselor, a family therapist, a spiritual director, a hospice administrator, worked in healthcare organizations. So he just comes with lots and lots of life experience and different perspectives. And we're so thrilled that he's here to share his book with us today. And Bill's book, When Tears Sing, The Art of Lament in Christian Community. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to spotlight you so everybody can really get to know you as you introduce this book and this really a wonderful practice.
Thank you, Dawn, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the series, and also thanking the Taos Institute, which has been really important for me for a really long time. It's also great to see old friends and some new friends. So thanks for being here. So at its heart, my book is Memoir. The book builds on my very early and ongoing history with the backhander. I call this reality or construction the backhander, and how I have worked to disappoint and undermine the backhander in my life, the lives of those near to me, those with whom I meet, the communities I inhabit and serve. I have learned that lament, more specifically lamentational relation, endures and subverts the backhander. Lamentational relation creates possibility, hope, what the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s called the beloved community. The backhand and its innumerable first cousins are artisans of ridicule, humiliation, shame, and a lot more. And the backhand has a long and horrific history. When underlings act uppity, that is, as equals, the backhand restores hierarchy. Husband, wife, parent, child, master, slave, and since 1619 in America, white, black. My first experience with the backhander was domestic, around our hearth. The backhand was the way my father kept my mother, and by extension, his children, in our place. My second experience of the backhander was the public square. Broad Avenue in Albany, Georgia is where I grew up. The Albany movement, one of the most violent chapters of the civil rights movement, and Dr. King's first failure, so to speak, unfolded in front of my father's clothing store between the fall of 1961 and the summer of 1962. I witnessed as a bystander and through nightly newscast on Channel 10 WALB. I witnessed white men brutalize black bodies. I witnessed backhand's first cousins, the whip, fire hose, German shepherds, restore order, so to speak. And a teenager proudly took a carload of us, 9 and 10 years old, to see one of Albany's landmarks, a lynching tree. I have experienced less literal backhands in the medical and what I call the medical and mental health industrial complexes, which more unknowingly humiliate, shame, and cause pain. Recently, a new diagnosis entered the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It's called prolonged grief disorder, as in chronic mourning. I have yet to really study this entry, but my first reaction, and it's certainly open for critical analysis, is how can one with eyes and hearts at least half open, not regularly, mourn life the way it really is? Another less literal backhand is that of organized religion, which I have experienced among my tribe, the Christian world. Roughly 81% of the American church support Donald Trump and his friends. American evangelical conservatives are arm in arm with those who would make America as white, straight, and insular as possible. A church whose Bible is manifest destiny exceptionalism. Still trying to integrate what I learned yesterday. CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference in the United States, will hold this year's annual meeting in Hungary. Keynote speaker is Viktor Orban, a dictator, good friend, and ally of Vladimir Putin. So you may sense that my book is more and less than a grief book. The book is an exposition on what I have found to be and believe is the backhander's arch rival, the fourfold arc of lament, which I will briefly outline in a minute. Before I do, I'd like to address the matter of my priesthood. I was not a little fearful of showing up to present a book that has the phrase Christian community in it. I've been ordained 41 years and I draw a pension from the Episcopal Church. On a recent walk with my bishop after reading a really wonderful and disturbing book, The Church Cracked Open by Stephanie Spellers, I said to my Bishop Thomas, I am about an inch away from leaving the church, to which he replied, Bill, you've been an inch away from leaving the church for 4 decades. Touche. What keeps me in the church? I have over time come to a quieter construction of God as the space between, as in what is happening among us this morning, as in Kenneth Gergen's communicamus ergo sum, we relate, therefore I am, as in Harlene Anderson's early construction of therapy as just talking with people. God for me is one of many names for what early feminist queer theologian Carter Hayward calls right relation. Lament is the context of my quieter reconstruction of God. Lament not so much as the more personal response to the experiences of loss, illness, marginalization, erasure, violence, and lynching. Rather, lament as a relational dance on the stage of life the way it really is. Lament, this might be hard to sink in before reading the book. I see lament as a way of life. lament as subversive relation, lament as protest against the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am armor of the pilgrim seeking, defending, preserving the individuated self against the assaults on one's material and relational property. Lament as relational dance has 4 movements. A relational arc from despair to joy. And this movement became so obvious to me in my work with and experience in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And mostly and powerfully in the 5 years I spent at Grady Hospital in Atlanta. Grady's mission was to the indigent poor in Fulton County and wider. I was director of the hospice program, and we basically cared for impoverished African Americans who were dying. And then in around 1984, all of a sudden, these young white men showed up at Grady with AIDS. These were the martyr Matthew Shepherds of the world, who had been ostracized and sent out of, particularly in the Southeast, sent out of their hometowns, many of them from a middle and upper middle class world. They showed up and got a green card at Grady, and we cared for them both in the AIDS clinic and through the hospice. The African American, mostly the African American women in our hospice program opened their arms so wide to those young men. And as we know, those young men came to be women and many, many more people who were caught up in the first phase of the AIDS pandemic. Those women, if you ask them, do they believe in homosexuality? Say, no, not really. Our church doesn't believe in that, but I sure love to care for these young men. And that for me was my deepest and I'd say powerful experience of the beloved community. Okay. Lament as relational dance, 4 movements, a relational arc from despair to joy. The first experience in that arc is wailing, what I call wailing. And wailing is the muted, inarticulate noise of sorrowful, suffering, and traumatized persons who knowingly and unknowingly ache for connection. I named 3 dimensions of wailing, and I'll read that for you. Wailing has at least 3 dimensions. Wailing erupts now and again in each of our lives the way they really are. That's the first way. Second, wailing is the noise of our cultural malaise. And 3, wailing is the ongoing and unending experience of trauma victims. First, wailing is the clamor we all make at times. Philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff reflects on an early attempt to write about the sudden and tragic loss of his son, Eric. Rather early in the process of writing, I tried to join the fragments into a continuous flow, but it didn't work. My life had been fragmented, so my lament would have to be fragmented as well. I think of the white space between the fragments as silence. In the face of death, we should not talk much. Second, wailing is the din of an officially optimistic society, to quote John Douglas Hall. that relocates despair to the closet. Despair is insidiously covert. A sense of futility and hopelessness masquerades under the guise of well-being so pervasive as to deceive the wearers of the mask themselves. Sometimes our wailing is easy to spot and name. A 3-year-old child wanders away from its parents before boarding a Sunday afternoon flight home from Orlando after a week at Disney World. Its parents are buried in their cell phones before they have to put them on airplane mode. Their distraction is broken by a cry they know well. As they sprint to the sound, their child flails about, panicking at their absence. Not so easy to spot and name as wailing is a 45-year-old striding through the airport, adrift but not aware of it, not looking at it. He or she wears an expensive business suit, wireless earbuds in, waving a phone like a baton, talking with a ghost, a subordinate back at corporate, getting ready to go to a consequential meeting. There is the exciting possibility of the startup soon converting to a buyout. But if and when it does, the itch remains. Our culture is wired to create new needs when old ones are met. The person's wailing might be embodied as chronic lower bowel syndrome, insomnia, uncontrolled anger, or an affair that is dragging on. Meanwhile, what of the spouse who may be weaving through the week with an enduring heartache accompanied by episodic howls, restless to hear some comforting words? Third, wailing is a dominating and undiminished language of the victims of trauma. Victims of trauma live outside what I call and learn to call the restitution narrative. If you aren't getting better, you're malingering. There's something wrong with you. The restitution narrative of our officially optimistic society. Numbed silence often prevails. An excerpt from a letter written by Makangingwi Lee, a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. I quote, "My primary concern, however, is still my mother. She is very old and she has been through so much. If you look closely, all the people who inhabit this village are traumatized. She is in this category. She lives in a very deep silence. I try to entertain her, but you realize that she is overwhelmed with sorrow. The survivors live in a vast loneliness. This is the case with my mother, Mama Emma. Even now, she cannot fully understand what happened." When the sound of wailing is heard, often it is a rushed noise that tries to catch up with the experience and hogtie it with words. The staccato pacing of and then pecks away at both the testifier and witness. The trauma narrative is always beyond speech, and thus it is always lacking speech. The chaos is what can never be told. It is the whole in the telling. The challenge for those who witness the narratives of trauma victims is to be still and stay present, to resist helping them fill the whole. We are called to hear them for all the ways in which their testimonies do not cohere or find resolution. So that's wailing. And wailing, the next place in the arc is lament, and I'll read a bit about that. First, I'll read a short passage about the segue from wailing to lament. Lament is more indifferent from the solitary wailing walls to which we bring our sorrow, suffering, and trauma. By wailing wall, I mean my early morning walks around the pond down the street several years ago. There, my less constrained howls helped me better accompany Victoria through cancer. By lament, I mean Victoria and me talking together after my walks. In this conversational space, our anxiety was eased enough to bring our fears into conversation. Such conversation was our way to go on together, as Wittgenstein liked to say. Lament's parish home might be an ordinary Wednesday morning Bible study or the lingering of two choir members in the parking lot after choir practice Wednesday night. Okay, wailing. 20th century Russian philosopher, literary critic, and Eastern Orthodox Christian Mikhail Bakhtin writes, "Two voices is the minimum for life, the minimum for existence." Old Testament scholar Angela Bauer, writing about our nation's fractured sense of lament in relation to 9/11, remembers Jeremiah's appeal to women to teach one another the art of leading the people in mourning. If the women who have led the lament are professionals, now each woman is asked to teach her female companion a dirge, both staying within their role as leaders of the mourning rituals and including the wider community of women who, during wartime, are the only ones left at home to join in. Indeed, the circle of addressees who are called to carry out the command widens to invite each and every woman as an instructor of another in their communal crying. Women across generations, regardless of family connections or any other implicit boundaries of race and class, are learning to sing the songs of mourning. Beyond discrimination, the divine imperative has become inclusive. From God through the women keeners, the melody of mourning has moved to every woman. As I just read this, I'm just wondering about the keeners in Ukraine now, who are serving an incredible role by bringing people into lamentational conversation and relation. My friend Mike, following the martyrdom of Tree of Life Synagogue, that was in Pittsburgh, you may remember, reread Leon Westler's Kaddish and shared the following excerpt. There has arrived from Brooklyn a new edition of the rulings of Chaim ben Isaac of the late 13th century. Chaim reports on another practice in 13th century Germany, of which he obviously approves. In Speyer, it is a custom that a mourner, before the days of his mourning are over, leaves his house to join the funeral procession of another dead and to bury him, though this should only be done after the first 3 days. It would seem cruel for an individual just back from one funeral to be hustled out to another funeral. But in truth, it is not cruel. It is an exercise in social responsibility. The mourner, too, has a social responsibility. His experience has conferred upon him an expertise that others need. Grief must not impede the specialist in grief. The disconsolate are the masters of consolation. They offer sympathy without illusion. So from wailing to lamentational relation, lament, the next station in the arc is solidarity. I can imagine the solidarity being experienced in Ukraine now as people have gathered to mourn. So from wailing to lament to solidarity. I'll read about a true artisan of solidarity born of lament. It's from the civil rights movement, particularly the Freedom Summer of 1964. Fannie Lou Hammer and so many like her knew how to lift up those who bore more pain than they thought they could bear. Historian Nishani Fraser says, I always think of Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was 45 years old, working as a sharecropper out of Mississippi. The woman had, I don't even think she had gotten past maybe sixth grade, maybe eighth grade tops. So certainly she was not the most literate person. And the woman could move people. I think her story is a story that you tell above anyone else's, because it literally speaks to the sense of the nobody being able to move everybody. And the impact is just powerful. It's almost like, why couldn't Dr. King move somebody? He graduated from Morehouse College. He had a doctorate. My God, if he didn't, he'd just be lazy. And here's Fannie Lou Hamer, and she is dynamic. And the woman is close to being illiterate. So when you tell that story, I think that changes things. Friends of Miss Hamer talk about how she pushed fear aside. When fellow protesters were scared, she did not talk them down. She started humming or singing a spiritual. Soon the crowd joined in. Bernice Johnson Reagan, founder of the musical group Sweet Honey in the Rock, bears witness to the same power of lamentational relation. While a student at Albany State College, Reagan was jailed for leading a protest march. Reflecting on her experience in a makeshift jail crammed with sister lamenters, Bernice said, in jail, my voice changed. My voice deepened. Jail was Reagan's Juilliard. So from wailing to lament, lamentational relation, through which comes into being a great solidarity, comes what I call joy, a very ironic joy that is born out of shared sorrow, suffering, and trauma. It's not happiness. Here's a great couple of paragraphs about what I'm trying to communicate. On November 15, 2015, a 24-year-old African-American male, Jamar Clark, was shot and killed by two Minneapolis police officers. After his funeral, the funeral procession drove by the police station to show support for protesters who had occupied the site for several days. Barbara A. Holmes, then the new president of United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities and a part of the funeral procession, writes, the funeral procession entered the tight pathway surrounded by Black Lives Matter activists and allies. Every few feet, a door of a funeral car would be flung open and the occupants would jump out and dance as if their lives depended on the movement. The hip hop music blasted from the cars. The respect being paid was primal and authentic. They were performing authenticity and grief so profound that only feet could speak. Our hearts were breaking, our feet were moving, and there was joy unspeakable and full of glory. So that's the arc of lament that I think does stand down and certainly enables us to endure again, what I call the backhander, who is an artisan of ridicule, humiliation, shame, and a whole lot of pain. So that gives you a sense of sort of the canvas in which the book is painted or written. Rather than receive your questions now, I thought we'd move on and offer 3 vignettes from the book that each vignette has a question that I'll ask that in our breakout groups you can talk about. So bringing the questions that maybe have arisen from what I've offered and to these vignettes with the questions, which we'll talk about, that will give us a chance in maybe the last 30 minutes just to open up the floor and talk among one another. Does that sound okay? Okay, I'm going to get the first. I'm going to screen share first. Okay, here's the first vignette, and then we can move into our breakout session just for about 10 minutes. And don't see the breakout sessions as our only time to talk about what's going on. Look at the breakout sessions as just starter dough for the conversation we'll have when we all gather back. Emma Gonzalez, a survivor of the Marjorie Stone Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida, stood silent on the stage for 6.5 minutes at the March for Life rally against gun violence, tears streaming. The amount of time it took the shooter to kill 17 and injure 15 of her fellow students. The then Maine State Representative, Mr. Leslie Gibson, responded to her tearful silence. There is nothing about this skinhead lesbian that impresses me, and there is nothing that she has to say unless you are a frothing at the mouth moonbat. Ms. Gonzalez's silent tears rallied residents of Green, Maine, not far from here, to remove Mr. Gibson from the ballot in his reelection bid. Mikhail Bakhtin writes that in stillness there is no noise, while in silence there is a voice that does not speak. In stillness there is no noise, while in silence there is a voice that does not speak. In terms of lament, the voice that does not speak often is muted utterances torn from articulation and meaning by tragedy, violence, and loss. The voice is exiled. Ms. Gonzalez's silent tears and those who witnessed them create a relational act of redeeming the banished utterance. The residents of Green, Maine liberated Ms. Gonzalez's exiled voice to humanize a legislative district in Maine and the wider Maine community. Question: how might we thread relational silence in conversations that matter? So 10 minutes to talk about that in our groups.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back from your breakout rooms. And Bill, if you want to unmute yourself, you can lead us in our conversation here.
The second vignette's about hospitality. I'll read the vignette and then we'll look at the question and go from there. French philosopher Jacques Derrida, a friend of Emmanuel Levinas, who offered the eulogy at Levinas's funeral. And I'm mentioning Levinas because he fills up a few pages before this, wrote extensively on hospitality between 1990 and 2004, the year of his death. Derrida's passion for the subject grew out of France's increasingly nationalistic temper. Wow, and look what's going on today. Derrida constructed the idea of unconditional hospitality as the ideal from which a nation legislates conditional hospitality. Absolute hospitality requires that I open up my home and that I give not only to the foreigner, but to the absolute unknown anonymous other, and that I give place to them and I let them come, that I let them arrive and take place in the place I offer them without asking of them either reciprocity, entering into a pact, or even their names. Derrida writes that the nature of conditional hospitality includes a certain hostility, that the home is the property of the host, imposes on the stranger limitations of space, who's coming, range of action, dinner is at 6, and time, how long do you plan to stay? I love my times in retreat, wonderful, hospitable brothers, and both of the monasteries I visit for retreat require answers to these questions. Of course, and still. Derrida, in the spirit of Levinas's act of beholding the other, suggests that truer hospitality is best offered beyond the threshold of the host. The right of ownership and the privileges that come with it make of the host hospitality a power over dynamic. The atmosphere of hospitality in which we wait with the grieving and aggrieved suggests movement literally and relationally from the territory of the beholder to the territory of the beheld. When the post-resurrection Jesus cooked breakfast on the seashore for his bereaved disciples, fishermen, he prepared fish on their beach, his fish and their fish. When building the hospice at Mission Hill, we collaborated with the finest interior designers in the northeastern United States to create spaces that were extravagantly welcoming. Prints of Robert Mapplethorpe photographs, one ceiling painted as clouds, another as trellis entwined with grapevines. Our guests mostly were unimpressed. We had prepared deathbeds at the Ritz. They desired deathbeds that reflected the spirit and taste of the homes they had to leave. How do we fold unconditional hospitality in our more conditional work? Radical curiosity, a not knowing position. How do we figuratively move from our hearths to their hearths? So that's the second question.
All right, we're back from our breakout rooms, and Bill, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, since we're short on time, I think I'm just going to read the last vignette, and we'll see the question, and then we'll just open up the floor for a conversation about all that we've experienced up to then. Okay, so the medicalization of sorrow, suffering, and trauma. The transformation of personal grief to relational lament is compromised by two dominant cultural narratives. First, our experiences of sorrow, suffering, and trauma are colonized by professional experts organized into a unifying general view, replete with diagnostic categories and translated into the language of illness. Our now scrubbed down stories are handed back to us. They inform and instruct us and our loved ones about what's going on and what needs to be done about it. Our unwashed stories are now secondary alternative accounts. Sociologist Arthur Frank writes, folk no longer go to bed and die, cared for by family and neighbors who have a talent for healing. Folk go to paid professionals who reinterpret their pain as symptoms using a language that is unfamiliar and overwhelming. As congregations make conversational space for the sorrowful, suffering, and traumatized to be heard to voice, something more than venting takes place. Their stories are being handed back to them in their own words. Colloquial discourse helps redeem colonized pain. Just talking with people. Often during family therapy sessions at the Salem Center where I trained and worked, it was hard to distinguish between family members and the therapist. Family therapist Harlene Anderson and Harry Galician cited in previous chapters. We denounced ourselves as therapists. We decided what we did as just talking with people. Just talking with people is not dumbing down therapy, as the modernist institution of therapy initially argued in their objectification of the postmodern therapy movement. Just talking with people, as mentioned in previous chapters, flattens the hierarchy of expertise and redistributes it among all who participate in the conversation. All are learners and co-creators of new knowledge for life and relation. If such a therapy session seems similar to a walk with a friend around Jamaica Pond in Boston, that's because it is. The mental health industrial complex's size is not indicative of its merit. Its size, in part, is related to our culture's professionalization of love. Sigmund Freud had this to say about the Emmanuel Movement's layperson-led success at equipping and empowering those at and over the margins of daily life to carry on. The Emmanuel Movement started at Emmanuel Church at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century and became sort of a national phenom, led to a big argument between Freud and William James about who can do what. And the Emmanuel Movement has been cited as the origin of group therapy and a precursor to AA. So here's what Freud said about the Emmanuel Movement. The Emmanuel Movement, which, however, I have not had time to study carefully, will die down as have so many other movements. When I think that there are many physicians who have been studying modern methods of psychotherapy for decades and who yet practice it only with the greatest caution, this understanding, or with very superficial medical training, seems to me at the very least of questionable good. I can easily understand that the combination of church and psychotherapy appeals to the public, for the public has always had a certain weakness for everything that savors of mysteries and the mysterious, and these it probably suspects behind psychotherapy, which in reality has nothing, absolutely nothing mysterious about it. The nature of Freud's assessment, in my estimation, still persists. Questions. Question. How do we stand down the medical and mental health industrial complexes in our work? How do we open up space for people we see to have their own narratives at least offered along the way? So we don't have to discuss that specifically, but my sense is now we can just open the floor for any type of discussion or questions that we might have.
Hi, Bill, and hi,
Marty.
everyone. One of the, in my most recent breakout group, I think we made an interesting discovery. While I have known it, the recent telehealth work for therapists has felt different to me in many ways than the work in my office. And it occurred to us as we were talking that Harlene Anderson's guest host metaphor is one in which telehealth allows both therapist and client, people with whom we meet, to be both guests and hosts to one another. And so that kind of flattens any sort of hierarchy about this is my office. Just an observation, but one that I like.
Yeah, I like that too.
Hi, I want to really thank you, Bill, for putting this work together, because I study Karelian Lament. I know something about that. And so any kind of lament, when bringing the word in and changing the meaning of it, having us think about how we can revive something that served a purpose for us, I think biologically, for the centuries that we have suppressed. And so thank you.
Thank you. Would you say just a bit about Karelian Lament? I'm not familiar with that.
So Eastern Finland, when actually Russia took it over after the Winter War, the mothers would have, every village had their own lament for a different thing, like their son went to war or the woman got married, went to a different village, and each village had their own lament practice, and the children would learn it from the mothers that went into the woods and would cry, and sing crying was basically what it is. And so that's how it got passed down.
Thank you. How do you spell that?
Karelian. And Pirko, I'll write her name in here. Filman is a retired social worker in, she lives in Helsinki, but
Right.
she's who I learned about it from, and she has been reviving it for the last 25 years.
Wow.
Just usually in churches meetings. She does say it's not therapy. She says people make their own lament for their own. It's a more of a, well, she doesn't call it a spiritual practice either. It's simply lament, and you sing a little bit. It's a lot of metaphor and singing to your ancestors, kind of. Mm-hmm.
Just put a couple links in the chat that I found just now on that. So if you want to see that.
Thank you.
This is Martha. I grew up in a community with a small Finnish population, and I distinctly remember hearing about one of the elders who, when she went about certain tasks on their farm, people thought she was crying. And a couple of younger generations have said, no, she was singing in her old country way about what she did. The person that identified it for me was, as the Celtics would sing to the hearth, they'd sing to the animals, they'd sing to their shoes. There was a cry for almost every activity. I don't know if that fits with what you're describing, but I've heard about that in the community that I grew up in. Large Finnish populations have settled in Maine because it was so similar to Finland.
Well, singing to the woods, or singing to a tree, or to a bird, or to a stone, open space for a connection with the world that certainly can break our hearts, move our hearts, and connect us to the web, so to speak. So yeah, thank you, Marty.
Do you have a story or an example of a time of lament in either environmental justice or racial justice, where the lament helped move a group forward?
Yeah, one comes to mind. When I was at Bates College, there's a huge walkway between the administration building and a few of the dorms, leading to a new dining hall they were building, and they needed to go underground to do the electrical wires and stuff. So they cut down these trees that had been there for ever, and the president almost lost her job over that. One, because she did that, but also she did it while everybody was on Christmas break and no one knew that was going to happen. And when the community returned, we had all birch trees were planted, and people were not that happy with sort of a walkway of whiteness. But what we did, and the community was so upset, is that I was the multi-faith chaplain. We would, people would gather at the stumps, and we'd just circle the stumps and hold hands. And a lot of weeping, a lot of conversation about violation and erasure. and it created a way for the community to mourn. And so that's one example that comes to mind.
Bill, I just wanted to thank you for that presentation. A practical question: is the book out yet for purchase?
Yes, it is out. The publisher is Orbis Books, and they're offline now, and something of a disaster. They were upgrading their platform and their website, and it's been stuck. But you can order it from most anywhere at your local bookstore. And dare I say the A word, you can get it. You can get it in 3 days. But yeah, no, it's.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much. So I work for the Quakers in Britain.
Oh my goodness.
And famous for silence.
Yeah.
And also famous for the Book of Sufferings. But the interesting thing is, a lot of these practices are not used in how we organize as a community. It's all about managerialism. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to recover silence, suffering. They have something called ethical suffering, which I find really interesting concept, to bring it back into how we organize the Quaker movement, as it were. So I was basically calling in to get tips, and I just found your presentation so moving, and the story is so moving. So thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Could you put your name and address and email in the chat? I'd love to follow up with you. That sounds really fascinating what you're doing. Yeah, thanks for what you're doing. My goodness.
Bill, I really have appreciated your presentation this morning, and then the discussion that has developed around it. And for me, it's opened up many, many possibilities in a hopeful way of finding ways to lament in community. So it's very exciting, as opposed to my somewhat usual dread of lament. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you so much.
Bill, I'd like to make an observation about the last bit that you read to us, as opposed to the first two. And I think it goes on also to, and I can't remember specifically what you were reading at the end of the last segment, but as you were reading it, there was an entirely different pace and tone to what you were reading, which to me was coming off about the distancing that we do, because so much of say, for example, end of life in the hospital, as opposed to there's this drive to accomplish things with the passing of someone. And as you were reading it, it came across that it was so data driven, that there was this very quick pace reading of this until you came closer to the end, and I just remember pulling out the word mystery from what you were reading, and
Freud's
that whole thing with Freud, whom I've never much liked anyway, but at any rate, I think that there needs to, obviously things need to be taken care of, but that I think that if we bring more mystery if we lend an ear more to the mystery that is around us on a daily basis, that our lives are much more enriched. And I just bring it to the point of, I was with my mother when she passed in the hospital. It was the most profound experience that I have ever had. And I simply went out and probably maybe 5 minutes after she drew her last breath, and I let the hospital staff know, and they were immediately ready to, sweep in and, remove my mother. And I said to the charge nurse, I said, is it all right if I simply sit with my mom? And she said, absolutely. And they, and they retreated. And, I spoke with her later, and she said, that was just unusual, because most people don't make that kind of request. So, I guess I'm trying to say, I think that bringing into balance and acknowledgement the mystery that we see from moment to moment.
Yeah. What comes up for me, Tina, is really important for me to say. I think words are, in many ways, the least effective way to connect. It immediately puts us in a more linear relation with whatever's going on. And Alita certainly mentioned that. You're talking about that. Marty talked about her experience in the community she grew up. I mean, you taught dance at Colby for so long, and it just seems there's so many different, even better or relational ways to engage in lamentational relation rather than words, but more than words, if that makes any sense. Yeah. So thank you. All right, I think it's 12:30. Don, I'll turn it over to you, I think. And thank you all so much, and for the gift of what I've learned from this.
Thank you, Bill, for being with us today and sharing your book and inspirations. And thank you all for joining. I know we appreciate everyone participating in these free dialogue with the authors, just to have a time to connect and explore together, and be looking for the next one. We will try to do them every month. We might skip one in the summer, but you can look for the next one through our emails. And just have a great day or evening or wherever you are in the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dawn. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Tina.